Monica, congratulations on an amazing conference. To be able to bring 30 people from around the world, from various disciplines, to talk about such a complex and enigmatic subject is certainly a testimony to your vision and to your impact at the school. So, and to those that organized the event, thank you for the invitation. I do think it's a question of ethics and aesthetics. I do think that it's a complex discussion that certainly cannot be reconciled, and it lives between the material and the immaterial world. I do think we live in a time of the infra-thin, where the very genome of the body is being assessed, the building blocks that underlie life, and what are the consequences for architecture? How might the base equations that underlie life begin to have a consequence in the discipline of architecture? The organizational logic of things that are invisible, that represent a kind of magic, a kind of divine condition, certainly represent a biological mimesis, and function on an analogical level to teach us about how we may apply or construct a certain methodological approach to research. Chimerical material, excitable matter, that lives between states. This is a ferrofluid that is both a liquid and a solid. With the right magnetic impulse, it can take on a wonderment of morphological transformations. The invention of matter certainly seems to me to be a necessity in the future of architecture. We have a reputation for residing within these towers, where we are able to kind of conceptualize the world and certainly represent it with the machines at our disposal, but can we implement it? Can we leave those towers and begin to engender and participate in the conversation of other disciplines, whether they be material science, whether they be the building industry in terms of next generation building components, whether they be about policy, or business models that empower us to move this into the world at a variety of scales. Escher, obviously a very known amateur mathematician and graphic designer, illustrator, certainly someone I think holds an enigmatic role in the beginning or the middle part of the 20th century in terms of a certain kind of paradoxical question, and that is, could you design a unit of construction that is sufficiently intelligent that when aggregated, it can create infinite variation. To me, that's a beautiful model on a variety of levels, certainly on a more literal level in terms of architecture. The idea that computation would be able to understand on the most increment level these base equations, and there would be a clarity and an eloquence to the way that equation performs in order to achieve the kind of work that's necessary as it spins out. If you were to move even further as a business model, we live at a time where there's a kind of rapid expansion of globalization, that territories and regions and even legacies of communities as we know it may be at risk in terms of the homogeneity of the kind of dissolution of memory. Would it be possible in the context of a modular system if the larger aspiration is in fact to create a kind of infinite machine of difference? Might that difference accommodate the difference in the world? And all the kinds of tribal interests and impulses would be sustained and celebrated, not annihilated. I've always been fascinated. You know, it's interesting to talk about the future of technology. It seems to me to understand the future, you have to continually participate in a series of orbits that return back into time and look at the most kind of wonderful, enigmatic, and even paradoxical conditions that could, provide us with an enormous amount of intellectual and creative insight about how to navigate into the future. The history of ornament, which was which disappeared in the beginning of the 20th century. Much longer discussion in terms of minimalism, in terms of a kind of truth of materials. But it seems to me that if you look at these beautiful civilizations that indexed within the surface of architecture a series of mythological aspirations, that has a fantastic opportunity to be reassessed in the 21st century. One of the beautiful conflated conditions is that the calligraphy of that time participates on two levels simultaneously. It lives within a world of graphic iconography, right, as pure composition, and in another moment it can be extracted out as a legible text. It's almost as though these buildings are anamorphic surfaces. That is to say that at certain moments in time and space, and based on the kind of intentionality of the spectator, certain meaning can be extracted out of the surface conditions. I actually think that we live at a time where we have both the digital design and manufacturing capabilities of reassessing the surface so that it can operate to accommodate for a number of interests. This happens to be a kind of mathematical array of the word Allah written into an infinite expanse. I'm also fascinated by, you've got architecture or surface as something that operates on a syntactical level. It certainly operates in terms of material performance and the kinds of programmatic activities that are engendered by it. It's important to acknowledge the fact that all surfaces participate within a kind of performative theater, a spectacle, and these are retinal skins. There's a whole legacy throughout the history of art and architecture that understands the kind of, let's say, the anatomy of the eye and the physiognomy of how spaces and surfaces are to be interpreted and how we can manage and regulate those kinds of effects and impressions by how we design the architecture itself. Op art, to me, is one that is looking for a kind of animate condition, an intended vibration that achieves a multiplicity of differences, although in this particular case it's a two-dimensional surface. If in fact you were to rethink this as a conceptual model or an ideogram, to what extent are there a variety of architectures or worlds with any one condition? The question is the author a master of their craft? Are they capable of understanding the necessity of the participation of the inhabitant and the kinds of effects that will emerge out of it? This is Marcel Wander's beautiful chair. I think it's not only an amazing object, but I think it's emblematic of this kind of fantastic paradigm shift where the notion of ornament or certain kinds of surface registrations that we attribute to being an applique now take on the role of a structural system. This is, once again, a perfect example of something that is simultaneously questioning the role of a syntactical condition in architecture, that architecture can be read like a book, but it's also living in the world of physics. Gaudi is certainly another example of that. I suppose this kind of recalls some of the things that Hernan was speaking about, and although he didn't use the term, but there's this kind of fantastic opportunity to open up a different taxonomic system in terms of how we may evaluate both our methodological processes and the kinds of effects that spin out into a cultural domain with respect to an intended perversity. The chair itself, having to abide by a kind of hyper-pragmatism, is certainly being put in a subversive challenge right here, insofar as it's kind of clad within a kind of latex sock. And chairs that are normally understood as having a kind of dialectical relationship in terms of promoting a conversation are now put back to back. what kinds of new social constructions and terrains would emerge as a result of this kinds of strangeness. I will show 3 projects. They occur at different times of our career. This is the Helia Scope. We were commissioned by the Frack Center some years ago because they were very conscious of the fact that we were working with, it was a digital practice, certainly fascinated and committed to the effects of the surface in architecture, but also its ability to kind of move out into the world as a kind of desiring machine. Helia Scopes is not unlike some of the comments we've heard throughout the 2-day conference, which at some moment look to science fiction. If architecture traditionally is something that follows a kind of Greek manifesto, that it emerges from the horizon line up, what might be the future of architecture is something that descends from the sky down. These are an aggregation of helical tails. Each of them has an orifice at a critical moment, which accepts a LCD screen. A single occupant can actually inhabit each of the helical tails. It was intended as a modular system that could either be produced and sold as a single entity unit or aggregated into a field to accommodate for any kind of curatorial practice. These are a series of views. This is the wireframe. I think it's a kind of slight segue here. It's interesting that I happen to be of an era that moved from the analog to the digital. Probably everyone on the panel is from a generation where picking up the pencil and the pen was never a priority. I raise that issue because I just want to say the importance of one's method of research and the kinds of operative techniques, and I'm speaking to the students when I say this, the operative techniques that you're engaged in are absolutely essential in terms of imprinting their influence on the kind of outcome of the work, and assuming any kind of critical practice is one that is reiterative, that you would move back to go forward. I've always found it fascinating to reclaim what would constitute the kind of X-ray within the constructed nature of complex surfaces in order to understand better what's happening both at the local and the global scale. This is a shot of the single helical tail, and we CNC mill this in foam. In all of these projects, well, in all of our work, it's really important for us to move out of the computer into the physical realm. I think the more that the author-architect understands the means of fabrication, the easier it'll be to be able to move or begin certain questions and impulses within the virtual world in anticipation of moments of resistance and inadequacies within the fabricational systems that you're deploying. In this particular case, the surface is CNC milled out of a solid piece of foam. There's a 15-piece fiberglass resin shell that encompasses that entire foam piece, which you see here. In fact, this is out of order. Before the actual mold is put on, there's a foil paper that closes down the foam in order to create a release system. This is the entire piece prior to the mold itself. And these are shots of the final installation. It's a 1/4-inch thick fiberglass lightweight shell that can be more or less transported and suspended in any space. There would be a series of accessory elements that would reside on the periphery of the Helia Scope to accept an aggregated field. I had mentioned that there's an LCD panel inside, and it's made available in terms of its kind of larger consequence within the public domain. It's made available for industry, commerce, academia. Anyone could assume control over the curatorial agenda and message within that film. I should point out, and I didn't kind of mention this because we have to kind of move quickly on time and we are running out, that one of the points of departure for the project was a unique phenomenon that we came across called the Japanese love hotels. And this is a fantastic, it's a very strange and perverse industry that's taking place in Tokyo and a variety of cities in Japan, where they make these fantasy rooms and they sell these rooms. They construct the fantasy rooms according to a kind of imagistic cliche, and they're perfect. And there's clientele that will pay an exorbitant amount of money to obtain these rooms for anywhere between an hour or two. On one level, it's rather problematic and even ethically unsound for our discipline as architects, because it really is the perpetuation of historical moments in time as cliches, and they're commodifying them. On the other hand, I think it's testimony to the fact that the world is moving at a very quick and rapid speed, that it would be unreasonable to not acknowledge the fact that desirability and fantasy and the construction of these kinds of psychological impulses are certainly part of our profession, and they may be either foregrounded and privileged in our work, or certainly seen as a participant. This whole question of what constitutes a certain school of thought and the truth that lies behind it, I think, is open for debate. These are just a series of views. Obviously, one of my priorities in all of our work is creating the illusion that there's the animate possibility of architecture, that not unlike a great cinematographer who understands that the camera ultimately becomes the vehicle by which certain imagery or certain ideas within the film itself is going to be projected and made available to the audience. I think that the surface of architecture has the capacity at this moment in time, and certainly with the computational power that we have, to be able to engender that surface with a multiplicity of identities. And in relation to the occupant moving around these surfaces, it will always appear as though they're changing. This is a shot of that single occupant almost abducted temporarily, and in the context of a kind of paradoxical model, that the head would reside in the most private space and the body would be revealed and made public to the world at large, I find to be a rather compelling and strange proposition. This is a view of the opening, the orifice into the LCD panel, and there's an access panel that allows that to be open and closed. This is a second project of three. I'll try to move as quickly as possible. This is offered as a kind of an ideogram. The colors aren't coded with any specific agenda, but rather in the spirit of what I spoke about before, might the constructed surfaces of the 21st and 22nd century be woven together as a kind of constellation of interests, whether they are dealing with the ecological system of the world and the management of energy, or they would function as ornament to be able to kind of receive, again, the cultural impulses of a generation. These are a series of studies that are looking at the diagrid as a simple and elemental structural veneer and a second generation of accessory surfaces that are beginning to spin through that field. You'll see in a second, this was a project we were approached by a developer in New York City who is in the process of purchasing the UPS building, which is on the west side highway north of Houston Street. It's 3 blocks long. It's longer than the Empire State Building, and the idea was that the 7-story building would remain intact, and they would construct commercial pavilions on top of the roof. And they came to us to come up with a proposal for a continuous skin that would be an open air membrane that would hover above the pavilions and at some moment move up into the vertical axes to contain a hotel on the north side. So what you're looking at is a kind of an extracted series of studies that are trying to understand what would constitute a kind of smart envelope that really does live between two worlds. It would function to brand the entire roof of the building, which was absolutely essential in the context of a business model. It would function to serve as a kind of shadow theater, and then finally it would alter the microclimates of the building. It's a very schematic, it's at a very schematic phase now. We were working with Arup. It was put on hold, so we don't have all the drawings, and it's only at kind of second iteration at this point. These are a series. This one is a view of the diagrid transition between the horizontal and the vertical, a kind of cornered transition. I mentioned that the horizontal surface would be the trellis, which you'd be looking down on, and the brise-soleil is on the left. This was the first version. The second version changed dramatically in terms of both the height and the complexity of rotation of the hotel, which we're seeing here. This study is trying to understand how the membrane itself might unzip at critical moments in order to kind of reveal the sky, that the membrane, although it kind of totalizes the entire urban landscape, at certain moments it would release itself. And this is a shot of the whole piece. And these are a few renderings of the interiority of it. The pavilions itself, we were not asked to design. And certainly if it were to move to the next stage, there would be a far closer examination of the specificity of those accessory elements in the context of all those aspirations I mentioned before. And the final project is called Moon Jelly. This is a restaurant in Dumbo, Brooklyn, New York, which just opened. You're looking straight up at the reflected ceiling plan. In the context of something I had spoken earlier about ornament and the way in which ornament may operate not as a kind of apparatus of nostalgia, but an acknowledgement of memory, and whether that may be cultural memory, and it certainly is a very loaded question in terms of how it drifts from one region and one moment in time to another. There were a number of priorities with the ceiling of the restaurant, which acknowledged the fact that the kind of ground floor of the restaurant had to kind of maximize clientele and circulation, and that the spectacle would reside as a cloud, and like some strange familiar and unfamiliar world or sets of worlds, it was constantly in motion. There is a single, this is a reflected ceiling plan, there's a single hex tile, major piece that gets replicated, and it's been designed in such a way that it's capable of introducing us or allowing for connectivity and a series of wave patterns to move both in the clockwise and counterclockwise orientation. Certainly, we're trying to disguise or camouflage the unit of construction in favor of the effects of the field. It's an interesting surface. There are three apertures. One accepts the sound system, the other is the sprinkler system, and the third system is for the chandeliers. The chandeliers themselves, which I kind of bypassed quickly, were also custom made within the office. So we're interested, there was a discussion yesterday about technology and processes. I'm personally as interested in materials that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, as well as new ones. The chandeliers were created first and foremost by harnessing music wire and developing a set of crossings within the music wire that anticipated the injection of the glass and was specifically calibrated to allow the glass to bifurcate at critical moments. This transition is at the periphery of the high relief hex tile and a kind of low relief piece, so that there's a kind of massive scalar change. Certainly one of the difficulties in any modular system or the game of seriality is how to end it in the physical world. These are shots of the pieces themselves prior to being finished. As I mentioned, this is the kind of main tile, and the periphery tile is right there. There are 13 pieces that close up the hex tile, which are not shown in the shot. They were mass-produced out of a fire-rated polymer. They're 1/4 inch thick, lightweight, and they were just screwed to the ceiling, very easy. And as I said, they interfaced with all the systems in the ceiling. This is a shot in the factory before it came to the site. These are a series of views, and it raises, we've come beyond our time. It seems to me that every project ultimately has within it certain motivations that could spin out at any scale, at the scale of cities, the scale of furniture and buildings, and I think that's an affirmation to the fact that they're never over, and they're still very much alive and latent. And here's a kind of final shot that allows one to look up at the constellation, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.